And now, aviation weather around Alaska. Hello, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska aviation weather outlook for this weekend. It is Friday, April 5th, and coming up here, we have a couple of things to consider. There's a lingering area of low pressure in the northern Gulf. That's going to pull back toward Prince William Sound and wash out on Saturday. The most significant feature will be an area of low pressure in the lower Bering Sea Saturday morning. This low is heading southeastward, will cross the eastern Aleutians Saturday night and reemerge early Sunday morning in the North Pacific, or at least on the Pacific side of the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula. Meanwhile, a front arcing out ahead of that will see a secondary low develop and then work its way up into the central and then pull back toward the western Gulf later in the weekend and can just linger in this region through early next week. And if that's not enough, strong cold front. There's some late season Arctic air that's going to be sitting up here in the Arctic Ocean, coming down across the Chukchi Sea through the Bering Strait later this weekend, later Sunday into Monday. It's going to come all the way down across the Alaska Peninsula and be absorbed into that secondary low that'll be sitting over the western Gulf early next week. So be prepared for some gusty winds and colder temperatures, some areas seeing readings below zero once again. But Saturday morning, we expect pockets of IFR along especially the inner channels, intercoastal mountains of the Panhandle and northeastern Gulf Coast, pockets of IFR along the Alcan border around Mentasta Pass, also up along and north of the Yukon River, areas of the North Slope, Arctic coast down through Norton Sound, lower Yukon, and then out across the eastern, southeastern portion of the Bering Sea and Alaska Peninsula associated with that front that'll be pivoting north and northeastward. Come Saturday afternoon, generally widespread MVFR conditions across areas of the mainland, Gulf Coast, in through the Panhandle along Prince William Sound, and then back out across the Alaska Peninsula, where there will be areas of IFR near and east of Kodiak Island and just off of the Bristol Bay coastline. For Sunday morning, we see IFR conditions increase along the North Slope, especially eastern half of the Arctic coast, and we're also going to see that front, that cold front, begin to push southward, and by Sunday afternoon, that front will be advancing rather quickly southward along the west side of the state there through the Bering Strait. Still some pockets of IFR here along the inner channels, intercoastal mountains of the Panhandle, and also lingering there along areas of the southeast Bering. Sunday afternoon, we expect MVFR conditions along areas of the North Slope, eastern Arctic coast, in through the interior, down through the middle upper Yukon Valley, also along much of the Gulf Coast and Gulf. Some IFR conditions possible there, especially around Chilkoot and White Pass, and just along the Canadian intercoastal mountains. So here coming up for Saturday, we may see a little bit of IFR conditions around Anatuvik Pass give way to MVFR. A little east, Adigan Pass should generally experience MVFR conditions on Saturday. Further south and west, Lake Clark and Merrill will generally hold on to MVFR conditions, though I can't rule out Lake Clark might actually get into some VFR by afternoon or evening. Rainy Pass on up through Windy Pass, through Isabel Pass there in the Alaska Range will generally see MVFR conditions throughout the day Saturday. Further east, Mentasta Pass starting out with IFR conditions Saturday morning, giving way to MVFR. And then across the Copper River Basin, Tanita Pass, generally MVFR conditions. Same thing, Portage Pass, generally MVFR conditions from Mid-Pass out over Prince William Sound. And then in the far north end of the Panhandle, Chilkoot and White will start out IFR, giving way to MVFR conditions Saturday afternoon and evening. Freezing levels, the surface freezing line has bumped upward into the central Bering Sea to down across the Alaska Peninsula, Shelikof Strait along the Kenai coast and northern Gulf Coast into the inner channels there of the Panhandle. Freezing levels aloft are rather non-existent here through the mainland, but they do bump upward with this frontal system along and just behind the frontal system, 6,000 feet there into the North Pacific, south of the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula, as we will have that area of low pressure here in the lower Bering that's going to be tracking southeastward and cross there the eastern Aleutians come Saturday night in the early Sunday morning. So with the low in that position on Saturday, we anticipate broad areas of moderate icing possible here through the lower Bering, along the Aleutian chain, up through the Alaska Peninsula to the Kodiak Island into the southwestern lower portion of the Gulf, generally above 3,000 feet here over the lower Bering. In the vicinity of that front where you do have that kind of bump in the freezing levels aloft above 6,000 feet here, eastern Aleutians, lower end of the Alaska Peninsula. As we get out along the Gulf Coast, there could be some pockets of moderate icing in through especially northeastern Gulf Coast, northern Panhandle, even up through areas of the Copper River Basin above 2,000 feet. And then also another little area where we could see some icing up there along the Arctic coast, central Arctic coast, back toward the western portion of the North Slope above 2,000 feet. So the jet stream pattern at 30,000 feet, there is a jet core of 160 to 165 knots out of the west that is just south of the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula in the North Pacific. And as we bring it down to 700 millibars, or about 9,000 feet, we see a core of winds 50 to 70 knots in a similar position there near and south of the central Aleutians, and then certainly south of the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island in the North Pacific. And that, again, is a reflection of what's going on with that low that's going, the surface low that's going to be crossing the eastern Aleutians Saturday night. So the bulk of the strongest winds are along and south of the trough axis, so we expect winds 50 to as high as 65 knots along and south of Kodiak Island, and especially back through the central eastern Aleutians. And what this is going to translate to is a high likelihood of widespread moderate to isolated severe turbulence through the central and eastern Aleutians on Saturday, surface to 3,000 feet, and moderate turbulence up into areas of the Alaska Peninsula and along northern Bristol Bay, surface to 4,000 feet. And could be some isolated moderate turbulence along areas of the northern Gulf Coast and off of the Panhandle, and then also a little windier conditions here through the Bering Strait and up there at Point Hope, Cape Lisburne. So again, there could be some isolated moderate turbulence in those areas, surface to 3,000 feet. But as a reminder, by Sunday, especially Sunday afternoon, Sunday night, we are going to see a pretty good push of late season Arctic air with some winds dropping southward along the west side of the state. So look for winds to be increasing along these areas as well.